Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
Doing fantastic today, Tim. Hope all the listeners out there are doing just as fantastic. And even more so, I'm wondering how you're doing today, Tim. We have a great guest on, a returned guest that should really be making you happy. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. And I am happy to introduce our guest for this episode. She is one of our favorites. It's Laura Risti from the series we did on the disappearance of Trenny Gibson from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in 1976. Laura is back for some updates, Lance. We go through a little bit of Trenny's disappearance, the main points of the story, and then we get into some updates. And Laura has helped us with our series on the disappearance of Trenny Gibson. We've actually spun it off onto its own podcast feed, so if you want to hear those episodes, you can just search Missing Trenny Gibson in your favorite podcatcher, and you'll find those episodes. But Lance, she's got some bombshell information tonight.
It's really remarkable that she's been working on Trenny's disappearance for over 20 years. And she still, because of her due diligence, is able to uncover bombshells. The way she delivers the information is really nonchalant and subtle, which knocked us over even more because she recapped some of the disappearance, she gave us some new information, and then the bombshell hit.
Yeah, it's a really eye-opening conversation, kind of makes you rethink the entire disappearance. And Jennifer Amell also joins us for this conversation, Lance. And so you can find out more information about what Laura Risti is doing on her website. It's CanadianGirl77.com, and that's girl with a U. And she's also got a brand new Facebook page for her work on Trenny Gibson's case, so you can follow that. There's a link in the show notes for that.
And Tim, if someone wanted to listen to this episode plus all of the other episodes that we produce on this fine network, where would they go?
Well, Missing Premium is now available in your Apple Podcasts app. You can subscribe right there. It's $4.99 a month. You get ad-free episodes, you get early releases, and you get our weekly bonus show that people love. And if you're not an Apple user, you can go to missing.supportingcast.fm and subscribe for the same product there.
And if people are going to follow Laura Risti, like you suggested, where would you suggest they go if they were on the social media platforms to follow us?
Listeners can follow us everywhere at Missing CSM. Thanks a lot for listening, everyone. We're going to break quick for commercial here, and then we'll be right back with Laura Risti. Welcome back to Missing. Laura Risti. Laura, how are you tonight?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
We're doing great, and we're doing even better because this is a random Tuesday night, and we get to hang out with you, and it's been a long time since we've all hung out and talked some true crime mysteries. But yeah, this is it's great to finally reconnect with you.
Oh, it's wonderful. I've had a lot of people reach out to me and ask me, well, are you guys going to do more? Are you going to do it more? Are you going to do more? And I said, well, it's not completely up to me. So I said, you'll just have to stay tuned.
Great. Well, here we are, Laura. So thank you so much for joining us again. We did, I think, 5 or 6 episodes on the disappearance of Trenny Gibson. You have been looking into her case for years now. How long have you been looking into her case?
I started in 2003, but I've been looking into it on a daily basis and researching and interviewing and writing since 2005. So we're heading up to, in June, it'll be 18 years.
In June, it'll be 18 years, but you're only 2 years away from it being 2 decades of research and investigation into this one missing young woman. That I want you to remind everybody who's listening how this all came to you, how she sort of spoke to you.
Well, I guess it's safe to say that after all these years, Trenny has stuck with me. So if you're listening, Trenny, I'm in a way, I'm sorry about that, but it is what it is. Sometimes a higher power, that's higher than us decides these things, and we don't really have have a lot of say in the matter. We just have to go with it and have faith, kind of thing. But it was on just a regular Sunday morning when my husband and I were newly married that I discovered Trenny out of the blue one day on the Doe Network. We just gotten a home computer. We just gotten hooked up to dial-up internet, if you can remember those days. And a friend that I worked with suggested that I'd probably be really interested in perusing the Doe Network. So I kind of had this Sunday off, and I was doing some housework and some cooking before it got too hot, because it was going to be a hot summer day. And I just planned in between to load these pages on the Doe Network and just have a look-see through them. And I got to about 12 pages, and I thought, well, I should call this a day. It's starting to get hot. I want to wrap up the little bit I'm doing here and go to the back of the house before it gets too much hotter, because the back of the house was air conditioned. And this little voice just kind of said, just one more, just look at one more page. So I loaded one more page, and I had some music on in the background. It was Sirius XM radio, but it was over satellite. It was on the television. So I loaded the page and I started looking, and you got to understand, I've been researching missing persons cases since I've been interested since probably I was 7 or 8 years old. So a lot of the cases on the Doe Network were ones that I had seen before, but there were a few newbies. And then I just came across Trenny's photo, and she stared at me from her junior high school photo, which was actually taken the day before that she vanished. And something in her face just screamed, "Help me. You've got to help me." So I kind of got a shiver down my spine, and I thought, whoa, this is strange. I've never heard of this case. It just said Trenny Lynn Gibson, missing October 8th, 1976, from the Great Smoky Mountains. And so I clicked on it. Trenny's face came up on the screen, and I just had the strangest experience, like I couldn't breathe. I slid out of my computer chair. I felt like something was crushing my chest. And this song kept playing in the background, and it was Bob Dylan, was crooning in the background, Shelter from the Storm. And I looked at Trenny's face again, and just my brain was screaming, but I couldn't get my breath, and my brain was screaming, she knows who did this to her. She knows who did this to her. You've got to help her. So after what seemed like an eternity, I was able to get up off the ground. The pressure in my chest eased. I was able to breathe normally again and whatever. And then I just kind of sat in the chair and kept staring at her photo. And then I was able to kind of pull things together enough to use the mouse and scroll down and read the rest of her case story. And I remember thinking, like, I'd heard of the Smoky Mountains. I actually watched a Smoky Mountain Christmas with Dolly Parton when I was a little kid. And I remember when I calmed down a little further, my husband was always interested in maps. And I pulled the atlas down from the shelf above the computer and opened it up and looked to see where Tennessee even was, because aside from the Dolly Parton movie, and I knew that George Strait hung his hat there, really I didn't know a lot about the state. So that was kind of my story with how I came to bump into Trenny one Sunday in 2003.
I feel like there is a connection that some researchers have with a certain missing persons case, and it's kind of undeniable. And you clearly have a connection with Trenny's case and Trenny.
There's been times through all this that I've gotten really, really frustrated or really tired and felt like I couldn't go on any further with this, or I felt like I'd gone as far as I could go and I couldn't do it anymore. But for whatever reason, I just haven't been able to let her go. So, like I said, Trenny's stuck with me, and I intend to see this through until we come to some sort of conclusion as to what happened to her on that October day in 1976.
Okay, well, give us a brief overview if you don't mind, and then I'd love to get into some updates on the case.
Sure. Well, Treddy was 16 years old, and she was a junior at Bearden High in Knoxville, Tennessee. She lived in a nearby neighborhood. She lived on White Tower Drive. She had a really nice house. It was 1427 White Tower Drive. Nice red brick house, big backyard, so on and so forth. Her father was a salesman and he traveled a lot for work. And usually he was away for about 2 weeks out of every month. And her mother was a housewife. Trenny had an older brother, Bob, who was 2 years older than she was. She had a younger sister, Tina, who was 2 years younger. And then she had a baby brother, Miracle. I say baby, but he was 6 when Trenny disappeared. And Trenny had a job at the nearby Westtown Mall at Morrison's Cafeteria. She was a cafeteria worker, so she'd help the patrons out who came through the cafeteria line. She'd carry their trays for them and so on and so forth. And she was saving up her money because she wanted to buy a car eventually. And she also wanted to attend the University of Tennessee and study landscape architecture. So she was your typical schoolgirl. She was very smart in school. No problems with any of her teachers, anything like that. And she was just enjoying life. But Trenny was a bit of a homebody. She liked to read. She had friends at school, but they didn't really go back and forth. Like she really wasn't a social butterfly or anything like that. She tended to keep to herself. She and her brother Bob, they got along quite well. Bob had joined the Navy in July of 76. He'd been away since July, but he actually came home on leave 2 days before Trenny vanished on October 6th. And that was the first time Trenny had seen him since he left in July for his basic training and so on. So Trenny was in a class at Bearden. It was called Ornamental Horticulture. And it was an elective, and it was held in this new wing that Bearden High had just built. Um, was it ornamental horticulture was in that wing? I believe they had drafting, and they also had like child care, and there was maybe one or two other classes that were held in this special building. It was kind of like a vocational building, that sort of idea. So anyway, Trenny had this class, and I believe it was 3 hours long, and they talked all about plants and gardening, and they had a greenhouse. And the class was headed by a young teacher. His name was Mr. Wayne Dunlap. He had a degree in agriculture. I've talked to one of Mr. Dunlap's roommates from the University of Tennessee. Very down to earth guy, liked hiking, the outdoors, that sort of thing. He had a wife and a child, I believe, at the time that he was at Bearden. But this was his first year there teaching. And anyway, Mr. Dunlap had put together a plan for the horticulture class to take a trip to the Great Smoky Mountains and go on a hike and observe the plants and flora and fauna. That time of year, the Smoky Mountains, the leaves are changing and it's just gorgeous. So that's what he had planned to do. He planned to have someone help him chaperone the trip because there's going to be about 40 students. And originally, Trenny's mother, Hope Gibson, had offered to come along as a chaperone. So Trenny was looking forward to this trip and everything, and spending the day with her mother. And Mr. Dunlap, to kind of make it more mysterious, or however you want to say it, he didn't reveal the actual location of the trip. He wasn't going to, rather, until all the students were on the bus and the bus was going to leave the parking lot. So the students just knew that they were going to be on a field trip, but they didn't really know where they were going. Part of that, Mr. Dunlap claimed, was he didn't want anyone following them up there. So he didn't want the students to talk about it beforehand and anyone get any goofy ideas to follow the bus by car and that sort of thing. But when Hope Gibson found out that the trip was going to be an all-day affair, she ended up backing out. She said that she would have to get a babysitter for Trenny's youngest brother, and she, didn't really want to be gone all day. So I don't know exactly how much notice she gave Mr. Dunlap, but I do know that he tried in vain to find another person to come and chaperone that day, because I talked to his old college roommate, and he was one of the folks that he phoned. And this fellow has felt bad for years because he absolutely would have gone if he just would have had more notice, but he had to work the next day and there's no way he could get out of it, find a replacement or whatever. So he had to back out. Mr. Dunlap then decided that he was just going to go with it and he would take the students to the Smoky Mountains, but he actually was going to be the only adult on that trip, save for the fellow that was driving the bus. So the following day, Trenny showed up at school. She found out that the field trip was still a go. She kind of had thought that morning when she got up they might cancel it because it was raining. And the weather forecast really wasn't that good. It was supposed to be windy, temperatures cooler, that sort of thing. But when she got to school, she found out, yes, the trip was still a go. So she left everything in her mother's car except her bag lunch. So she had nothing on her. She left her purse in her mother's car and her books as well. She just had her bag lunch, and if she had some change or something in her pockets, that was it. She hadn't taken a jacket or hat with her that day. She lined up on the sidewalk with the rest of the students. Mr. Dunlap got the students on the bus. When they were all loaded and ready to leave, that's when he told the students they were going to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And, kids were cheering and happy and whatever, and happy to be out of school for a day and whatever, like we all would. And from what I can gather, they arrived at the Smoky Mountains National Park between 12 and 12:30 that afternoon. I presume, a bus doesn't travel as fast as regular passenger traffic, so, a little bit slower. Maybe they had to make a pit stop for kids to go to the bathroom. There was 40 of them after all. When they got to the park, then Mr. Dunlap told them that their instructions were to hike to Andrews Bald, and they could observe the plants and trees and grasses and leaves and wildlife, but they weren't allowed to pick anything, disturb anything like that. It was just like, look with your eyes and that's it. He expected them all back at the bus at 3:30 because then they'd head back to Knoxville. So Trenny had ridden to the park with a friend of her brother's named Robert Simpson. Robert Simpson was a good friend of Bob Gibson's, and Bob had asked Robert if he wouldn't mind just kind of keeping an eye on Trenny that day, because after her mother had backed out of the trip, Trenny was a little apprehensive. Well, maybe I shouldn't go or whatever. So her older brother got his friend Robert Simpson to kind of keep an eye out for her and whatever. And Trenny was cold because she hadn't brought a coat or a hat. So Robert actually took off his brown and orange plaid jacket and gave it to her to wear. Nothing untoward happened. They hiked from the parking lot to Andrews Bald. They ate their bag lunch on the way. Robert Simpson remarked he didn't think Trenny was planning to go anywhere because she shared her sandwich with him. They were at the Andrews Bald for a bit. Other students started arriving at the Bald. It started to rain a little bit. And that's kind of when things started to get a little weird, because Robert Simpson was tasked with keeping an eye on Trenny. And in those days, you didn't really shirk that sort of duty. But all of a sudden now, he wants to stay at the Bald, and Trenny is walking back down to the bus by herself. And the reason that Robert Simpson gave for staying behind was he wanted to go tracking a bear. So whatever the circumstance, whether Trenny didn't want any part of that gig or she thought Robert, was an idiot or what, we don't know. but she left his company and went to walk back down to the bus alone. So she's walking back down to the bus. She passed several groups of students hiking. They said that she didn't seem unhappy or anything like that. They thought she was walking a little fast, but aside from that, didn't really notice anything odd or unusual. She'd catch up with groups of hikers, walk in step with them for a while, and then speed up and carry on. And the last group that she hiked with, they were younger kids. They were sophomores, and they weren't. They knew who Trenny was, but they weren't friends. Like they weren't part of the same crowd. And they walked in step together for a while, and then the one young fellow, he had asthma, and he started wheezing a little bit. So one of the girls said, "Hey, let's sit down and rest a while." And they sat down on this rock to rest, and they tried to get Trenny to stay with them because she was breathing hard like they all were. And she said no, she wanted to keep going. So they sat on this rock while Trenny continued on. And one of the girls said she seemed to see something to the right of the trail because she seemed like she stopped. And she turned and looked at this thing, kind of bent down, and then it looked like she left the trail. So this girl thought this was kind of strange, but when they got up off the rock after their rest and continued on their way, she stopped at approximately the spot where she thought Trenny did. And she said it was odd Trenny would stop there because there really was nowhere to go. Like the trail went uphill. Um, there was shrubs. It was uphill, but there really wasn't any trail. It was just shrubs and overgrowth. There was nowhere to go. There was a small stream there that made kind of the bank slick. And one thing this girl mentioned, and actually this is still at this location today, there was a rock that had a dry spring in it. So it was literally a rock with water running out of it. And that marks the spot where Trenny apparently went off the trail. So this girl thought that, there's no way, I must be mistaken. Trenny didn't get off anywhere here. I must have just thought she did. She said she called out once, but there was no answer. So she just kind of shrugged and assumed Trenny would be, waiting down at the bus with the rest of the students when she got there. But when 3:30 came, Mr. Dunlap was doing roll, and Trenny was nowhere to be found. Um, and that's it. Like Trenny hasn't been seen since. The most prominent theories, and when the FBI got involved, there's a lot of people out there. Well, why were the FBI in on this? And really, it's because it took place on federal land. So that's why the FBI got involved. Their main theory was that Trenny was taken from the park by car because dogs picked up her scent at the side of the paved road in Collins Gap. So it's thought that she was taken there and then put in a vehicle, and then that's how she left the park. The other theory that they had, and I don't hold much stock in this one, but the other theory that they had was somebody basically abducted Trenny, and they took her and they held her in the Clingman's Dome Tower until the fog subsided enough that they were able to, like see the traffic, see the lights better, see where they were searching in the park, so on and so forth. Then she was walked basically down the Clingman's Dome Tower, the observation tower, taken to Collins Gap, and again put in a car. I don't hold much stock in that theory because why would you take somebody all the way up to the top of that tower? If somebody came up there and looked, you'd be a sitting duck. Like there's nowhere to go unless you jump off. Really. That could have happened, but I will say the abductor took a heck of a chance doing that, if that's what the case was. Part of that came from the dogs picked up Trenny's scent at the base of the tower.
And nowhere else?
They picked up her scent where she stepped off the trail. They picked it up at the base of the Clingman's Dome Tower, and they picked it up at the side of this paved road in Collins Gap.
Okay.
And that was several different dogs, and they all hit on the same result.
When did the dogs become a part of the search?
Basically the following day. So Trenny disappeared on a Friday. The search got going fairly quickly, but didn't really, aside from Mr. Dunlap and one ranger, didn't really pick up till about 6 o'clock that evening. Mr. Dunlap decided to stay behind and aid in the search, and he sent the busload of students back to Knoxville because the kids were scared, they were hungry, they were cold, so it was just easier to get them out. And Mr. Dunlap stayed behind and one ranger. And then about 6 o'clock is when reinforcements came. 4 other rangers, they brought flashlights, fuel, batteries, that sort of thing. And that's kind of when the search got going. But the search was hampered that night by high winds and rain.
And I know that you said that you've told this story of Trenny's disappearance hundreds of times. Does it ever get easier to tell the part about how Robert went to track a bear? Does it ever strike you as like reasonable that that's something that he did?
Well, I know Robert was an avid hiker around the time that Trenny went missing. He did know the Smokies very well. He was interested in the outdoors and nature. But kind of from where I'm sitting, the idea where he'd leave a pretty teenage girl and go back on his word to his best friend to go after a bear just seems ludicrous. I mean, there might be somebody out there that might correct me if I'm wrong, but what a ridiculous predicament you might be putting yourself in. I mean, you don't have a firearm, and secondly, you're leaving this pretty teenage girl. You're going back on your word to your buddy because you're interested in this bear. Like, it really doesn't make a lot of sense.
No, it makes no sense.
A better explanation might have been where, I really had to go to the bathroom. So I told Trenny, would you care to wait for me? I need to go into the woods here. I've got to use the bathroom. Just wait for me. I'll just be a couple minutes, and then we'll walk back down the trail together. Or do you want to start walking and I'll catch up with you? I'll just be a couple of minutes. Just stick to the main trail. But I believe he blurted like the first thing that came to mind. And that was this bear story, ridiculous as it was. And then once he said it, well, he kind of had to stick with it. So that's my thoughts on it.
Well, we only get this bear statement from Robert in the retelling, right? Because nobody overheard that conversation, so he would have had to say it twice.
When he was back at the school bus that day, and they realized that, hey, there's no Trenny. One of the students said to Robert, hey, wasn't Trenny with you? And he mentioned she was, but he went off to track a bear and she went off by herself. So he mentioned that at the parking lot, and he also mentioned that in his written report. His written statement that he gave the police was he was tracking a bear and Trenny went off alone. And I've had people telling me, bears, there are no bears that time of year. They're hibernating and whatever. And I don't know, even if he came across a stray one, why would you want to why would you want to take that chance?
That's why he didn't find any bears.
Yeah, there's some people that wished he would have, but that's completely another story. And Robert Simpson actually passed away last fall, so we shouldn't speak ill of the dead if we can help it. But yeah, so
that's sad to hear.
Yeah, complications from COVID, I hear.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
I have a quick question, or maybe it's not so quick. So I'm looking at the timeline again, and they're supposed to meet back at the bus at about 3:30, right? So that's
right, yeah.
Students are getting back. Do you think Trenny had enough time to leave Robert, walk down the trail past that group of students, and then get back to the parking lot and something happened to her there?
That's a possibility. I have not ruled that out. It's more of something that's going to come along the lines of when we speak about any updates on this case or on this story. Or would you just like me to talk about it now?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
sure.
perfectly fine. Okay. Well, about 14 months ago, I was granted an interview with a branch of Trenny's family, and they've never gone public before. They've been watching what I've been doing with Trenny's case in terms of research and so on, but they've just stayed quietly in the background. And 14 months ago, they finally were granted an interview with me. They want to remain anonymous, but they don't want the information that they gave me to remain quiet. They want me to bring it to the surface and speak about it. I was very honored that they let me, they talked to me and gave me some more information, and that they're, trusting me with this. But one of the things that they've suspected from the start is that Trenny's brother Bob, who was home on leave from the Navy, he had something to do with Trenny's disappearance. And before anybody gets excited, I don't mean directly. He did not harm Trenny, nothing like that. It's more along the lines of somebody that he was involved with or something he was involved in led to Trenny's disappearance. The one fellow that I spoke with is related through Trenny, through one of her uncles, and he was there searching for Trenny the next day, the day after she went missing. So this would have been October 9th. And he was an avid hunter at the time, and he was 18 years old. And he and his father and his other uncle, they came to help search for Trenny. And when you track animals, you get to learn a lot about their footprints, the twigs they step on and break, and any kind of sign, and so on and so forth. And he said what happened was somebody hunkered down close to where these cigarette butts were, and that half a can of beer that was still fresh enough to smell, that they found. And this person that hunkered down, they had to have been a male because they were heavier and they had bigger footprints. And somebody hunkered down next to them, somebody smaller and lighter, so possibly a female. And they had size 7 Adidas tennis shoe prints like Trenny did. She wore Adidas tennis shoes when she was missing. And it looked like they just hunkered down there next to each other for a few moments, perhaps while the male had a cigarette and finished some of his beer. The cigarette butts that were on the ground were the same brand that Bob Gibson smoked. And this can of beer, or half can of beer rather, was the same brand that he drank. Mind you, of course, there's tons of people out there that would, drink the same kind of beer, smoke the same kind of cigarettes. So this relative, he got a baggie and a twig, and he got the cigarette butts in a baggie, and he gave them to a park ranger and said, "Yeah, look at these." And the ranger said, "Well, these aren't anything," and he threw them out. So we know that the beer can, was never tested for fingerprints. And we know that the cigarette butts were never tested for DNA or if you could get prints on them. I mean, rather safe, because in those days there was no DNA, that sort of thing. But this fellow said that he and his father and his uncle, it just pointed to Bob, because who would Trenny get off the trail for? She might have for a girl, a female that was in her class. She might have for somebody in authority like Mr. Dunlap or a park ranger. But if Robert Simpson had propositioned her up on Andrews Bald, and that was the reason why she took off and went down the trail alone, I mean, no, she would have been ticked at him. She wouldn't have gotten off the trail for him. So they tended to think Bob had something to do with it. Now, how he got Trenny to go with him, I don't know. Bob wasn't necessarily the most responsible person out there. he may have told Trenny that, oh yeah, like I talked to your teacher and whatever, and why don't you come and get in the car with me and we're going to go to such and whatever. And then something bad happened, either along the way or when they got there. The other thing that this branch of the family suspects may have happened was Trenny was pregnant, and her brother Bob came home and he had plans to take her somewhere, perhaps to get this taken care of, whether it was an abortion or something else, and then something happened. That was the other theory they had. But they believe that Bob somehow held the key to this. They wanted me to bring this to the public's attention, that they definitely suspect that there was something not quite right in all this. They also suspect that Trenny's mother, Hope Gibson, knows a lot more than she's telling. She may not know where Trenny is, but she knows a lot of information that she should have, if not made public, she should have let people know that we're searching for Trenny, because it probably would have made a lot of difference. I've kind of come to realize that there's something in all of this that she's afraid is going to get out, and it's going to make somebody look very, very, very bad. Now, if she's figured I've already stumbled across it or I'm about to, that remains to be seen. But she's cut off all contact with me. And she has now for at least the past couple of years.
Now, when you said something happened, so Trenny might have been pregnant and they were taking her to get it taken care of. When you said something happened, do you mean something would have happened during the abortion?
Yes, either on the way there or what happened with the abortion. I'll tell you a little bit about some of the research I've done, and this isn't a pleasant thing to have to research, but sometimes you got to step out of your comfort zone. I started talking to people, that were in like the 60 to 70 age category, because that would have been the same age as Trenny's peers when she went missing. The Roe versus Wade in the 70s made abortion legal. But from what I've come to understand, nobody in Knoxville wanted to do it. Even though it was legal, nobody wanted to do it. To have an abortion legally, not, like a backdoor place or anything like that, you had to go to Kentucky.
So it was a little bit of a drive, a little bit of a process.
Yeah. You'd have to go to Kentucky. So it wasn't like, Trenny could find somebody in Knoxville, find a doctor in Knoxville, either go alone or get Bob to take her or whatever. Nobody wanted to do them. You had to go out of state.
That makes sense why she might leave the state. But I'm wondering, Laura, had you suspected Bob of involvement with any of this? Like, what was your reaction to hearing that?
I've suspected Bob for a long time. I'm sorry, but there always was this nagging little sing-song voice in the back of my head that Bob came home on Wednesday and Trenny disappeared on Friday. I don't know why, and I still 100% don't know why, that little song plays the way that it does. But when I spoke with this branch of the family, I wasn't shocked. It was more confirmation.
And this is Trenny's brother, Bob, we're talking about.
Yes, Bob Gibson Jr.
Okay. And how long was he gone in the military? Like, when was the last time Trenny saw him before he had come back, before she went missing?
He joined the Navy and he was shipped out in July. So she hadn't seen him since July, and then he came home October 6th.
Gotcha. And so say Trenny was pregnant. Do we have any idea who the father might be and why Bob would go through all this trouble to help his sister, besides loving her and wanting her to be okay?
No, I don't know who the father is or was. Trenny wasn't dating anybody that I can ascertain at the time that this happened. I can see Bob trying to help her out, though. I can see that happening. Also, their father was due to come back that day. Their father was due to fly back that day. He was on a business trip in New Orleans. So it might have been, we got to get this taken care of, or so on and so forth. I don't want Dad to find out about it. I don't think Trenny's mother would have known, but I wouldn't necessarily say not. I asked this branch of the family now if Trenny was pregnant and she went to like an unwed mother's home, because things like that did exist in those days. I said, after she had the child, would you have any animosity towards her? And they said, absolutely not. They said there would be no reason for her to hide or not contact them or anything else. She could have come back whenever the heck she wanted to, and it would have been forgive and forget, and they just would have moved on with everything. Trenny was much loved. Like this fellow I talked to, he was a cousin of Trenny's, and she was absolutely his most favorite cousin. His uncle, Trenny, was his favorite niece, and her uncle's deceased now, but it affected him tremendously, Trenny's disappearance. He was absolutely shattered. He couldn't sleep at night. He'd literally be up in the middle of the night walking the side roads looking for Trenny.
And this information from these folks sounds plausible to you after having researched the case for almost 18 years?
Plausible, yes, but there are some chunks missing. I don't think they're holding back anything. They seem very, very sincere to me. But there's some pieces to the puzzle missing yet, and like I said, I'm hoping to uncover more. But I believe Hope Gibson definitely knows a lot more than what she's ever told me. There's been a few times along the way I've come to realize that she's tried to mislead me. Like I said, pride goeth before a fall. There's something she doesn't want me to uncover, and I probably already figured it out or stumbled across it or conjured it up backwards, but it's already there. Like, I never took this on because I wanted to make somebody's family, pardon me, look like a bunch of assholes. That's not my motivation at all. I just want to find out what happened to Trenny. I think she got a really raw deal. I'd like to see justice for her, and if her remains are there, Christian burial.
I feel like thrown through a loop. I was not expecting any of this. But Laura, what do you think the reasoning was behind leaving from this school trip? Like, does that make any sense to you?
It would have made more sense if, of course, if they would have left from Knoxville. Why they left from the school trip, the only thing that I can come up with is, like I said, Bob was not exactly the most responsible guy. I've questioned Hope Gibson's as to where his whereabouts even were. Because one thing that I didn't really understand was, okay, Bob is home. He's home on leave from the Navy. You wanted to go on your daughter's field trip, and you couldn't because you needed a babysitter for your youngest. Well, Bob's here. Can't he either A, take your place on the field trip, or B, mind his younger brother so Hope could go? But nobody seems to know, pardon me again, where the hell Bob even was. Like, all I can say is he's probably drunk or with some woman or both. But he sure wasn't helping out matters that day. He wasn't, looking after his younger brother. He wasn't going on the field trip with his sister. He wasn't doing much of anything.
But one of the thoughts that these folks put forward to you was that he was there in the park. Did I hear that correctly?
He was definitely in the park.
He was. So the brother was in the park.
Yeah. Bob smoked a strange, well, I say strange, I don't smoke, but Bob smoked a kind of cigarettes that they were in the 70s, they were readily available, they were cheap, they were called Parliament. You can Google them if you like, there's a Wikipedia page about them, and they had this really funny triangular shaped filter on them. And apparently those were the cigarettes that were found in this little pile where somebody had hunkered down, smoked a few cigarettes, and drank part of this can of beer. And these same cigarettes were found at the side of the paved road in Collins Gap where the dogs had picked up her scent.
Interesting. I'm sorry, Laura. You may have said this before, but how do we know that Bob was there in the park?
Well, we're going by, of course, the cigarettes and the beer, and the fact that who would Trenny get off the trail for? Well, yes, he would have been a likely suspect. We can't place where exactly Bob was that day, so that's what makes it possible. Did he actually leave his calling card behind? No, he did not. This is just another possibility in what could have happened to her.
In your opinion, is it reasonable to think that when the field trip was decided upon, it wasn't canceled and Trenny was going to go, then a plan was put into place to take her from the field trip to bring her to get this abortion? So come off the trail with me. We'll sneak down to the car so that we can sneak away.
Yeah, I think what happened was Bob likely slept in. Like I said, we don't know where his whereabouts were that day. We don't even know if he was under the Gibson roof or he was with somebody else. We don't know. What I think happened is, if this is true, that Bob went to the park, is whenever he got up, he got in his car or borrowed a car from, because the Gibsons had 2 cars, borrowed a car, went to the school. Bob had attended Bearden. He had graduated the May before. He knew like most of Trenny's classmates, so on and so forth. If he didn't know where the field trip, like where they were headed, he might have been able to find out from somebody. Oh yeah, they were going to the Smokies or whatever. I don't believe that all the kids on the school bus were completely astonished to find out they were going to the Smokies. I think some of the information, it was likely it leaked somehow, and they kind of knew where they were going, because really, like, if you were female, you didn't want to come to school that day, wearing nice dress shoes, maybe a skirt, to find out that you were going to the Smoky Mountains. So I think there was some kind of an understanding, or a few students knew. So perhaps that's how Bob found out. And then he got in his car, and then he headed up to the Smokies. There's another rumor, well, maybe he followed the bus, and he very well could have. We don't know. Another branch to this is the family that spoke to me. They thought Robert Simpson was also involved in this. Again, not necessarily he harmed Trenny, but perhaps he was a bit of a stall for time. Perhaps he knew that Bob was going to drive up there. And he kind of told Trenny that, oh yeah, Bob's just waiting for you down the trail a ways. Why don't you go down and find him? And I'm gonna be a minute or two, and then I'll come down or whatever. We don't know if there was some plan between the 3 of them, and it may not have had anything to do with an abortion or pregnancy or anything in that realm. It could have even been that they kind of had a plan, Bob and Robert Simpson, that maybe, they were going to go back to Knoxville and hang out that evening. We don't know.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Tell us about what Robert Simpson was doing when he was checking the voice messages in the Gibson house before they could hear them.
Well, back in those days, there wasn't any voicemail or anything like that. What he was doing was he was screening their phone calls. So he was at the Gibson house, basically answering the phone for them, taking down any messages. And we don't know, like, if he was doing it correctly or what. We don't know if he was talking to people. We don't know what exactly happened. But anyway, he was doing that. He was persistent about doing that. And the Gibsons had people, it was family members, at their house taking care of things, because Tina and Miracle were still attending school and they needed someone to watch the house and everything. And it was one of these folks that reported that, yeah, you got Robert Simpson here, and he's just like made himself right at home, and he's like screening all the phone calls, and I can't get him to leave. So then that definitely raised alarm bells, and he finally did stop when he was told by the Gibsons that he needed to stop doing that. They did not want somebody screening their calls.
How did, remind us, how did law enforcement handle any investigation into him?
Well, there really was very little investigation into him because of who Robert Simpson's father was. Robert Simpson's father was Robert Simpson Sr., and he was a very prominent Knoxville lawyer. You can Google him if you like, read about his cases. He actually was a very, very brilliant man. He was deputy district attorney at the time of Trenny's disappearance. So when the police brought Robert Simpson in to question him about his whereabouts, that day, like what transpired during his hike to Andrews Bald with Trenny, so on and so forth, what he was doing after she left and walked down the trail alone, he did make a written statement that he gave the police. And the police were suspicious of him and they wanted to keep him for further questioning. But his father got wind of what was going on and he burst in and said that you guys have nothing on him. You can't keep him. You can't hold him. And basically, he took his son home, and that was the end of the whole investigation into Robert Simpson Jr.
Wow. And Bob, Trenny's brother, what about him? Was he investigated at all? Did he speak openly at any point, in your opinion?
There's a handful of newspaper articles where Bob did speak. He just said that he and Trenny were very, very close, and he doesn't know what happened to her, but he said she wouldn't have left the park willingly. Like she would have put up a fight if somebody had tried to take her. So he said that's really all he had to say about the matter and that they'd always been close.
This is another opinion question. I know that things were different then, and you mentioned Roe versus Wade, and they had to drive far away. But if it was the case that she was pregnant, what on earth would be so bad that it would be shameful to the entire family? And how would her disappearance be related to that? And people would find out that she was pregnant, and now it's a big scandal. Like, how did it blow up into that?
Well, I've always kind of had a suspicion that Trenny's disappearance had something to, like, it was racially motivated somehow. Like there was something racial involved in it somehow. Like I said, I've always suspected Bob had some kind of, he was mixed up in it somehow. And I've also believed that there's some racial element in this as well. And I've also believed it's likely there were drugs involved. Now, the one thing that would definitely raise severe alarm bells back in those days in the South, and I mean, it really wouldn't have been any different up here, so I'm not trying to, to pass judgment or anything. But what if Trenny was pregnant by a black man?
What about Kelvin Bowman?
Well, Calvin Bowman was an African American youth, yes, and I also found out that Trenny was also interested in another young African American fellow. As far as I can ascertain, if he and Trenny ever had any encounters or meetings, it was done on the sly. But I do know that she was interested in him. He was a young basketball player. If you were pregnant in those days, it did bring some shame to the family, pregnant out of wedlock. It wasn't necessarily like the 1950s. It wasn't the end of the world, whether or not they were going to, Trenny was going to stay home and have this baby. In those days, there wasn't anything like there is nowadays with high school where you could take your child to like a daycare center, anything like that, and then go to high school. Like just times were very different then. Basically, if you were an unwed teen mom, it was stood to reason you're probably going to drop out of school. But there are of course exceptions, and there were exceptions to that rule. But one definite way to make someone say, "Oh my goodness, this will never fly," you're going to have to terminate the pregnancy, is if you were to find out that your daughter had relations with a black fellow and now the child was going to be a mixed race. Would that have led necessarily to abortion or maybe just sending Trenny away to an unwed mother's home? It sort of depends on how extreme it might be. I tend to think because of Hope's faith, they were very strict Southern Baptist, that it would probably mean that they would have to terminate the pregnancy.
And if I'm not mistaken, Hope actually shot Kelvin in the foot, right?
Yeah, she did. I can understand that happening. She was trying to defend her home and her family. But a lot of the break-in with Calvin Bowman, it happened on October 11th, 1975. So nearly a year to the day that Trenny went missing. That's when Calvin broke into the Gibson house one night. This story was always kind of downplayed by Hope Gibson. She said that Calvin was there to see Bob. She was outside and he was intoxicated and he was calling for Bob, looking for Bob, and so on and so forth. And he seemed to know exactly what window was Trenny's, and that's where he headed over, was to Trenny's window, and was kind of like struggling with something. There was this planter box in front of Trenny's window, and Hope was watching all of this from the bathroom window. And when he stuck his foot out, that's when she shot him with her pistol from the upstairs window. According to what Trenny's youngest brother told me, it wasn't really like, oh, I'm here to see Bob, and oh, hey, here's Trenny's window or whatever, I'm going to say hi to her. It was far more serious than that. He smashed the window. He was trying to drag Trenny outside onto the grass and rape her. Some of the words he was using, I can't repeat here. And Trenny got away from him, and she took off down the hallway to get her mother. And that's when Calvin, in his intoxicated state, I don't know if he kind of fell in Trenny's room when he was struggling with her or what, but he gained access to the house. And he surrendered then to Trenny's mother. And she said that she paused a minute because she remembered that, okay, Calvin has a mother. He belongs to someone. And then that's what kind of kept her from blowing him to kingdom come. But from what I was told, it was quite there was glass smashing and everything else. And he was ready to drag Trenny outside onto the lawn, and he was going to rape her.
Okay, so now all of these pieces together don't seem to make sense to me. Calvin Bowman seems like almost like an enemy of the family, so I don't know how he and Trenny could have gotten together.
He definitely was an enemy after that point. But the point that I'm kind of trying to make was, I believe Trenny and Calvin were friendly to one another. At school or whatever, they had some sort of a history together. Because why on earth would Calvin come by and go directly to Trenny's window? Like, how did he know what window was hers? Unless she had maybe told him, or perhaps he had been there on a previous occasion. We don't know. But I believe they had some sort of history together, and likely it was they were friendly. And perhaps Calvin this night, maybe they had a fight, kind of broke up, or Calvin this night was full of liquid courage and God knows what else, and he turned up at Trenny's and demanded a little action, and she said no, and so he decided to smash the window and drag her outside and take what he figured he could get. But I think they definitely had a history together. But of course, after that point, Trenny wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. He vowed revenge when they went to court because the Gibsons had him charged for breaking in. And he was sentenced to 2 years in a juvenile correctional facility, but he only ended up serving 6 months. And he was back at Bearden by the time, like, Trenny went missing. So he was back in time for the school year to start in September of 1976.
But now if Calvin and Trenny weren't close after that point, then she couldn't have gotten pregnant from him, right?
Not by him, unless it was something like it happened by force. Because Trenny wanted nothing to do with him, and she was terrified of him.
Okay.
And he was heckling her at school and generally being a pain in the ass. Like, she really didn't want anything to do with him. So if the baby was Calvin's, if there even was such a thing as a pregnancy, it had to have happened by force.
And I mean, you would think though, if it happened by force, and Trenny would have maybe told somebody about that.
Yes and no. I'm kind of on the fence about that.
Yeah.
I've had people ask me. Like again, it was a different time back then. There's a lot of shame, a lot of stigma attached to that. I don't know if she would have told anybody or not, or if she would have told maybe like Bob over her mother and said, like this is what happened to me or whatever. I can see, a pregnancy as a result of rape. I can see Trenny's logic or reasoning, or lack of a better way to maybe say it, where she'd want to have an abortion if that happened, whether she was pregnant over consensual sex.
Now, tell me about this drug connection that you mentioned.
Well, there was a lot of pot happening in those days. Bob was an avid user. He was also an avid user of other drugs. And this was confirmed by the branch of the family that I spoke with, that Bob was a fairly heavy drug user. Robert Simpson, yes, mainly pot. Might have branched out in a few other things, but he was mainly just a pot smoker. Calvin Bowman, he used drugs, but he didn't sell drugs. He didn't have the kind of money that it would take to back something like that. He was more along the lines of the kind of guy, whereas if you wanted something, he could hook you up. He could be the middleman. But he wasn't a drug dealer or anything like that I could ascertain. But it's possible in all this that Bob was connected somehow to the wrong people. Perhaps he owed somebody money, something like that. Trenny had a lot of money in her desk drawer when she disappeared. Like, do want to put it out there, Trenny did work at a job, and she was an avid saver. Like, she spent her money carefully. She did have a bank account, but she had a lot of cash in her desk drawer at home. And, that might have been nothing. It just might have been, money she got from her birthday or something like that. Or like I said, I have a bit of a cynical nature. I have to. Perhaps she got it from somewhere else. Drugs might be a possible way that you could have a lot of cash on you. Was she selling something for Bob? Was she a courier, perhaps? Bob was mixed up with the wrong crowd, and that's what caused the disappearance. That's something I'm looking into.
How much money was found in her drawer?
A couple $100, which was, is nothing nowadays, but that was a lot of money in 1976 for a 16-year-old girl.
Was there any implication that this was sort of like a trafficking situation, or like a sex working situation?
No, I don't believe that. Trenny was like a sex worker or anything like that. I think it's more maybe she was selling a little pot or something on the side. Bob might have gotten her involved in that sort of thing. Or are you referring to human trafficking? Was Trenny abducted and used for that purpose? It's a possibility. But I tend to think more that Trenny was taken by somebody that she knew.
Wow. Well, this has been really interesting. Definitely some unexpected information here tonight presented by you, Laura. So thank you for sharing. Are there any other updates that you've got?
Well, I can tell you that I've been in touch with Dwight McCarter. Now, if you know much about hiking in the Smokies and the general area, he's quite a legend. Dwight McCarter is. He's a tracker. He's an avid hiker, and he worked for the Park Service for years. He's long since retired. Last few years before COVID, he did several talks and seminars and things like that. He's a very interesting guy. He's been looking for and finding lost people in the Smokies for many years. He participated in the search for Dennis Martin. He served in the Vietnam War. Then he joined the Park Service. And he also participated in the search for Trenny Gibson. And Trenny and Dennis were two kids that went missing and that were never found, of course. And I reached out to Dwight, and I had an interview with him. And he told me something, and he said it with certainty. Trenny disappeared, he said, after she'd had a spat with her teacher. And that was the first time that anybody had ever told me that. Dwight didn't know what it was about, but that was definitely new information for me, that she'd had some kind of a spat with her teacher. And as you know, I've reached out to Mr. Dunlap many times over the years. He never would grant me an interview, not even indirectly. I have spoken a lot with his University of Tennessee roommate, and he's been excellent in trying to help me. But sadly, Mr. Dunlap passed away last September. So whatever he knew about Trenny's disappearance that I don't know, he took that to the grave with him. So hopefully he's at peace. I know he was a very troubled soul after Trenny disappeared, and it was something that was extremely difficult for him to deal with. So hopefully he's at peace.
Oh, it's incredible how this story just keeps unfolding in these really bizarre ways. I mean, when we first spoke to you about Trenny, I just had a completely different feeling about Trenny. And hearing these updates has given me a really surreal perspective of her disappearance, because I have to shift my, I guess, perspective of her.
Yeah, and I've had to shift my perspective a bit too, and it's kind of like peeling an onion and peeling back a layer, peeling back a layer. But my main goal in all of this is to try to look at everything with an open mind and try to look at every angle possible, whether it's unpleasant or not unpleasant or whatever. But I've come to realize in the last few years that for whatever reason, Hope Gibson, she's not really on my side in all this. She's playing her cards very close to her chest. She told me one time before we stopped speaking that there were 3 people that were involved in Trenny's disappearance. And she and we talked about Calvin Bowman, we talked about Robert Simpson, but whoever this third person is, she doesn't want to divulge their identity. Whether it's somebody of the family, example, is it Bob Gibson Jr., indirectly, of course, or is it someone in the community of higher standing? Or is it somebody that's going to turn on her and make her look really bad? That part I don't know. Like I said, she's playing those cards very close to her chest. And really, like the family that gave me the information, that granted me the interview 14 months ago, like they said, they don't even care anymore. They just want to know what happened to Trenny. They just want to know, and that really upsets them. Whereas if Hope does know who did this, who was behind it, and why doesn't she just tell them? Why doesn't she just divulge it and get it over with, so that they can live out their last few years here on Earth? Okay, well, we know what happened. Like they said, they're not interested in pointing fingers. Well, you should have, or you could have, or all this. They don't care anymore. They just want to know what happened to her and why. I'm the same way. I do want to see justice for Trenny. If the person that did this is out there and still walks among us, they should be caught and punished. But if they're not, like I'm with them. I just want to know. And by holding out on that information, you're not doing anybody any good. Like you think that you're doing yourself some good, keeping it quiet for whatever reason, why you don't want it brought to light. But you know what? Secrets really make us sick. You're not doing any good by keeping it held within, because we're not getting anywhere. I have tried to get in touch with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the Federal Bureau of Investigation to see if there's any information that I can obtain about the investigation into Trenny's disappearance through the Freedom of Information Act, but I've gotten nowhere with it. Tennessee's kind of a funny state. They don't want to allow me any of that information even though it's the Freedom of Information Act, unless I have a subpoena. So the family that I was speaking with, I got all the paperwork from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I forwarded it to them. They were going to try and see if they could get the information based on the fact that they're family of Trennies. But as of right now, they haven't gotten a reply yet. So we're still waiting.
Laura, did you started a Facebook page recently for Trenny, right?
Yes, I did. It's just called Searching for Trenny. If anyone's interested, go over and have a look. If it's something you want to join, just send a friend request. I still have my original page that I put up for Trenny at www.canadiangirl77.com as well.
Every time we speak to you about Trenny's disappearance, it always strikes me that you're one of the very few advocates that the person you're fighting for, somewhere, if they're seeing this happen, should feel very lucky to have, because you're just absolutely relentless. So keep up the amazing work.
Well, thank you very much. Like I said, Trenny's rather stuck with me, so I intend to see this through. And I just, like I said, I just want to find out what happened to her. For my own sake and the sake of many others, because through platforms such as this, we've brought a whole new legion of listeners and readers and watchers to this case that never heard of it before. Through that, we're able to shine a light on this, and her case isn't forgotten, and she's not forgotten.
Well, we are happy to help in any way we can. So thank you.
Well, thank you again, and a big shout out to my friend Jim in Kingsport, Tennessee, that still continues to help me on this case.